let me ask you something before we go anywhere. When you hear the word civilization, what do you actually picture? Pyramids, probably. Pharaohs. Clay tablets covered in wedge-shaped script. Maybe a king's name carved into stone so that 3,000 years later, we would still know how to say it out loud. Writing is the thing that lets a civilization speak for itself. And that is exactly the problem, because writing is also incredibly young. Compared to the full span of complex human society, writing has existed for the blink of an eye, which means for tens of thousands of years before the first scribe ever pressed a reed into wet clay, there were people. Not scattered bands of wanderers. Not the cartoon cave dwellers you were shown in a 4th grade textbook. There were planners, builders, astronomers, traders, artists, and in some cases entire cities. And every single one of them is mute. They cannot correct us. They cannot tell us their own name for themselves. We only have what they left behind in the dirt. And the dirt, if you know how to read it, turns out to be surprisingly talkative. Think about how strange this actually is once you slow down and look at it directly. We call the period before writing prehistory, as if nothing worth recording as history was happening yet. As if the human story only really starts once someone figures out how to scratch symbols onto a surface. But a name is not the same thing as a fact, and the fact is that human beings were building complex, cooperative, symbolic societies for a span of time roughly 6 times longer than everything that has happened since writing was invented. Empires rose and fell in that silence. Trade networks stretched across entire continents in that silence. People fell in love, buried their children, argued about leadership, worshipped something bigger than themselves, all in that silence. We just were not there to transcribe it, and neither were they, because the tool for transcription had not been built yet. So tonight you and I are going to do something a little unusual. We are not going to walk through 10 ruins in a straight line, oldest to newest, like a museum audio guide. Instead, we are going to meet 10 different societies that all share the same haunting condition. They built, they believed, they organized thousands of human beings around a shared purpose, and then they vanished into silence. Not because they were simple, but because no one had yet invented the tool that lets the dead speak to the living. By the end, I think you are going to notice something about your own idea of what counts as civilized. Because the question underneath all of this is not really who built these places. The question is, why did we ever assume silence meant nothing was being said? Number 1, the temple that broke archaeology. Let us start with the site that rewrote the opening chapter of human history almost overnight. It is called Göbekli Tepe, and it sits on a low limestone ridge in what is now southeastern Turkey. The dates here are honestly absurd. We are talking somewhere around 9600 BCE, more than 11,500 years ago, roughly 6,000 years before Stonehenge, roughly 7,000 years before the pyramids at Giza. And here is the detail that broke the old textbook logic completely. The people who built it had no farming, no pottery, no metal, no writing, and no permanent villages that we have found nearby. According to the old model, you were supposed to need agriculture first. Farming feeds a surplus. Surplus lets some people stop hunting and start building. Building lets you construct monuments. Göbekli Tepe runs that whole sequence backwards. It looks like these hunter-gatherers built the monument first, and the need to feed the workers who gathered to build it may have been one of the pressures that pushed people toward farming in the first place. Now picture the actual labor. You are part of a group of maybe a few hundred people, some of whom have walked in from valleys many days away. In front of you is a T-shaped limestone pillar taller than a grown man, and it weighs somewhere between 10-20 tons. There are no wheels. There are no draft animals domesticated yet. There is rope, wood, human muscle, and an almost unbearable amount of coordinated will. The quarry sits a short distance downhill, and one unfinished pillar still lies there today. Half cut, cracked before it could be freed from the bedrock, a monument to the exact moment the labor failed. You can smell the dust the stone chisels throw up, feel the rope bite into your palms, as dozens of people lean back in unison against a weight that does not want to move. Someone has to feed everyone, which means someone has to organize hunts and gather wild grain in quantities large enough to keep hundreds of laborers working for weeks at a stretch. Someone has to organize the labor into shifts. someone has to carve the animals into the stone, the foxes, the boars, the vultures, the scorpions, with a precision that still impresses stonemasons today. And then, this is the part that should stop you cold. When a circle of pillars was finished, they buried it. Deliberately. On purpose. They filled the enclosure with rubble and dirt and built a new ring nearby, over and over, for roughly 1,500 years. Why does that matter for our story? Because right at the start, you have to throw out the modern assumption that monumental building only happens after civilization arrives. Here, the monument appears to have helped invent civilization. The people were not primitive. They were early. There is a difference, and Göbekli Tepe is where that difference lives in stone. Number 2, the city with no rulers. Now consider a totally different kind of settlement. One built not around a temple, but around ordinary life stacked on top of itself, literally. Move forward a couple of thousand years and into the same general region, to a mound in central Turkey called Çatalhöyük. By around 7500 BCE, this place had grown into one of the largest human settlements on Earth, with population estimates running as high as several thousand people living in a dense, sprawling cluster of mud brick houses. And I want you to feel what daily life looked like here, because it is genuinely strange to modern eyes. There were no streets. None. The houses were built wall to wall, packed together like cells in a honeycomb. And you moved through the settlement by walking across the rooftops and climbing down a ladder through a hole in the ceiling into your own home. Your front door was in your ceiling. Inside, the walls were plastered smooth and repainted again and again with hunting scenes, geometric patterns, and enormous vivid murals of leopards facing each other nose to nose. Picture the smell of that interior air, wood smoke from a small hearth tucked into the corner, the Swedish rot of grain stores, the dust of fresh plaster drying on a wall that will be painted over yet again in a few months. Because these murals were not meant to last forever. They were repainted layer upon layer as a kind of living ritual. Dozens of coats stacked on top of each other. Over the life of a single house, the dead were buried under the floor, right beneath where the living slept. Sometimes, with their skulls plastered and painted to keep something like a face present in the house long after the body was gone, so that every night you would lie down to sleep directly above your grandmother, your infant sibling, your ancestor folded into the very foundation you stood on. There is no obvious palace here, no throne room, no single house that dwarfs the rest. Archaeologists have spent decades looking for evidence of kings, priests, or a ruling elite at Çatalhöyük, and the honest answer is they have not found one. The houses are remarkably similar in size and wealth for a settlement this large, which suggests something that should make you sit up straight. Thousands of people cooperating, sharing resources, maintaining order across generations. Apparently, without the top-down hierarchy we assume every real civilization needs. It stayed occupied for well over 1,000 years. Whatever held that many strangers together in that much density without collapsing into chaos, it was not a king's decree. It was something quieter, and we are still trying to understand exactly what. Number 3, the flute players of the Yellow River. Now switch with me again, because the next lens is about sound. On the banks of a tributary of the Yellow River in Henan Province, China, there is a site called Jiahu, occupied from roughly 7000 BCE. The people here were early rice farmers, and among the things they left behind were dozens of flutes carved from the wing bones of red-crowned cranes, drilled with precise finger holes. Several of them still play today. Musicologists have tested them, and they produce a scale close enough to a modern pentatonic and heptatonic toning that a musician alive right now can pick one up and perform something recognizable as a melody on an instrument that is 9,000 years old. Sit with that for a second. Before the wheel, before bronze, before a single word had ever been written down anywhere on Earth, someone in this river valley sat down, measured the spacing of finger holes on a hollow bone with enough precision to hit consistent pitches, and then taught someone else how to do it too. That is not survival behavior. That is culture in the purest sense. Knowledge passed down for the sake of beauty and shared feeling. Imagine the evening this might have happened in. The rice paddies quiet after a day of work, cooking fires low, someone lifting a crane's wing bone to their lips for the first time in front of an audience, and the sound that comes out is not a grunt or a whistle, but something with intention, something with a shape. One of the flutes recovered from Jiahu had actually cracked during its working life, and rather than discard it, whoever owned it drilled a neat row of repair holes along the crack and kept playing it, which tells you this was not a disposable tool. It was something worth mending, and there is more. Turtle shells found in burials at Jiahu are carved with symbols, some of which resemble characters that would appear in Chinese script thousands of years later. Though scholars are careful, and rightly so, not to call this writing. It may be proto-writing, a kind of marking system that carried meaning without yet being a full language on a page. What we can say for certain is that the people of Jiahu were fermenting rice, honey, and fruit into an early alcoholic drink, casting Bronze Age-style symbols into shell, and playing music in scales we still use. Long before history, in the sense of written record, there was already art, already ritual, already a group of people who had decided that some sounds mattered enough to preserve. Number 4. The calendar in the desert. Now consider the lens of the sky. Deep in the Nubian desert of southern Egypt, in a place so dry and hostile that almost nothing lives there today, sits a shallow basin called Nabta Playa. Around 7000 BCE, this was not desert. Seasonal monsoon rains filled it into a lake for part of the year, and cattle herding people gathered there in a rhythm tied to the water. Sometime before 4500 BCE, generations before the first pharaoh, before the first hieroglyph, they built something extraordinary. A circle of upright megaliths, or some more than 2 meters tall, arranged with specific gaps that appear to align with the summer solstice sunrise and with the positions of certain bright stars, if that alignment is correct. And there has been real scholarly argument about how precise it truly is. It would make this one of the oldest known astronomical monuments on the planet, built by people with no permanent architecture, no writing, and seemingly no central authority, but with an intimate, tested knowledge of the sky above their heads. Picture the scene itself. The playa is baked white and cracked most of the year, heat shimmering off the ground in visible waves. And then, for a handful of weeks, the rains arrive, and the whole basin fills with brown water, birds appearing seemingly out of nowhere to feed on it, cattle wading in up to their knees. You are standing among the upright stones at dawn on the longest day of the year, and the sun clears the horizon in exactly the gap left for it, a gap someone calculated, argued over, and physically dragged stone into place to mark, generations before you were born. Picture what that knowledge meant to them practically. Your entire way of life depended on the rains arriving on schedule. Too early, too late, too little, and your cattle die, and so do you. Watching the stars was not idle curiosity. It was the closest thing to a weather forecast a herding people could build, encoded not in a book, because there were no books, but in stone that could not lie, could not forget, and could not be misremembered around a campfire 20 years later. Nearby, archaeologists found carefully buried cattle, wrapped and interred with what looks like deliberate ceremony. Animals treated less like livestock and more like something sacred. Long before the Nile Valley produced its first god king, people in this desert had already built a machine for tracking time out of nothing but rock and the horizon, and they trusted it enough to plan their entire seasonal migration around it. Number 5. The towns that outgrew every city of their age. Now widen the lens to something almost nobody learns about in school, and it might be the most staggering entry on this entire list. In what is now Ukraine, Moldova, and Romania, a culture we call Cucuteni-Trypillia began building settlements around 5000 BCE that by their peak roughly 1,000 years later had grown into something startling. Some of these settlements covered several hundred hectares and may have housed populations in the thousands, with a few estimates pushing toward 10,000 or more residents. For comparison, that would have made them larger than many of the walled cities that would not exist in Mesopotamia for another 1,500 years, and yet you will not find these towns in most world history timelines for a strange and specific reason. The people of Cucuteni-Trypillia built no monumental temples, no royal tombs stuffed with treasure, no walls of fired brick that would survive millennia intact. They built with wood, clay, and thatch, arranged their houses in enormous concentric rings around open central spaces, and decorated their pottery with swirling red and black spirals so distinctive that a shard from one of these towns is instantly recognizable to a trained eye today. Walk the layout of one of these settlements from above, even now, using nothing but magnetometry data pulled from beneath a modern Ukrainian wheat field, and you can see it clearly. Ring after ring of house foundations, circling a wide-open plaza, like the growth rings of a tree, streets radiating outward with a regularity that looks planned rather than accidental. Thousands of households, each one roughly the same size as its neighbors, none of them dramatically larger, none of them clearly marked out as belonging to a ruler. There is no clear evidence of a ruling class, no palace complex towering over the rest. And then, roughly every 60 to 80 years, something remarkable happened. The entire settlement was deliberately burned to the ground, and the community rebuilt nearby. Archaeologists still debate why. Ritual renewal, soil exhaustion, pest infestation in the timber. Whatever the reason, imagine organizing thousands of people to burn down their own town on a schedule and start over, generation after generation, for well over 1,000 years, without a single word of it ever being written down. The scale is almost impossible to reconcile with how completely absent these people are from the popular story of civilization's beginning. Number 6. The pyramids nobody names. Now cross an entire ocean and move the clock forward slightly to the arid coastal valleys of Peru. Here, along the Supe River, a civilization we now call Norte Chico or Caral-Supe was raising monumental platform mounds by around 3500 BCE, making it, by most current estimates, the oldest known civilization anywhere in the Americas, and one of only a handful of places on Earth where complex society appears to have arisen independently rather than by contact or diffusion from somewhere else. The largest site, Caral itself, contains 6 major stone platform mounds, the tallest standing nearly 20 meters high, along with sunken circular plazas and residential architecture, all built roughly 2,000 years before Egypt's Great Pyramid. Picture standing at the base of the largest platform mound at dawn, the desert air still cold enough to see your breath, the Supe Valley, a thin green ribbon of cultivated cotton and squash, cutting through an otherwise bone-dry landscape. Somewhere below you, a musician lifts a flute carved from condor bone to their lips, and the sound carries strangely far in the dry air, bouncing off the mound's stone facing. Here is what should genuinely unsettle you. Archaeologists have found no evidence of warfare at Caral. No defensive walls, no weapons caches, no mutilated bodies in mass graves, the kind of grim signature that shows up at so many other early urban sites. What they have found instead are quipu, knotted cords that may represent an early recording system, along with flutes made from condor and pelican bone, and enormous quantities of cotton and dried fish, suggesting these coastal and inland communities were bound together not by conquest but by trade. A civilization, monumental, organized, spiritually sophisticated enough to build stepped pyramids oriented with apparent care toward astronomical events, existing without a writing system in the way we usually define one, and quite possibly without needing much of a standing army either. It sat there in the desert, forgotten by nearly everyone outside Peru, for 4,500 years, simply because it never got the chance to write its own name down for us to find. Even its modern name is borrowed, Caral, Norte Chico, labels assigned by the archaeologists who rediscovered it in the 20th century, because the people who actually lived there left us no word for what they called themselves, their gods, or the river valley that fed them. We are, in a very real sense, still waiting for an introduction that will now never come. Number 7. The mound builders of the Mississippi. Now come back north, into a landscape you might drive past without ever knowing what is underneath it. In northeastern Louisiana, hunter-gatherers who had not yet adopted farming as their primary way of life began, around 1700 BCE, constructing an enormous complex of earthworks, now known as Poverty Point. This was not a small undertaking. The site includes 6 concentric C-shaped ridges, forming a half-circle more than 3/4 of a mile across, along with a massive earthen mound estimated to have required moving something on the order of 200,000 cubic meters of soil, one basket load at a time, by people with no wheelbarrows, no draft animals, and no metal tools. Think about the sheer organizational discipline that demands. You cannot move that much earth with a handful of families working when they feel like it. You need coordinated labor, probably seasonal gatherings that drew people in from across a huge stretch of the Mississippi watershed, all cooperating on a shared project with no written plan, no blueprint, no contract. Imagine the work itself. Hundreds of people filing along the same worn paths day after day, each one carrying a woven basket of dirt on a shoulder or a hip, dumping it, turning around, walking back for more, the ridgeline rising by what must have felt like an imperceptible amount each single day, only becoming a monument when you finally step back after weeks and see what the accumulated labor of thousands of individual basket loads has actually built. Archaeologists have found raw materials at Poverty Point, exotic stone, copper, and other goods that originated hundreds, and in some cases well over 1,000 miles away, meaning these people were plugged into trade networks, spanning a huge portion of what is now the United States, all of it moving hand to hand, canoe to canoe, without a single receipt or ledger ever being written, because writing simply did not exist yet in this hemisphere. The purpose of the earthworks is still debated: ceremonial gathering ground, astronomical alignment, seasonal trading fair, possibly all three at once. What is not debated is the scale of coordinated human effort it represents, built entirely by people history books used to describe, inaccurately, as simple foragers. Number 8. The Island of Giants. Now shift the lens to stone again, but this time to an island so small you could walk across it in an afternoon. On Malta and its sister island Gozo, beginning around 3600 BCE, a Neolithic farming population began raising megalithic temple complexes, structures like Jgantija, Lajar Kim, and Nadra, built from limestone blocks so massive that later islanders, having lost all memory of who actually built them, assumed they must be the work of a race of giants, hence the names. These temples predate Stonehenge by roughly 1,000 years, and predate the pyramids of Egypt by longer still, which makes them, by most reckonings, the oldest known freestanding stone structures on the planet. Picture the engineering problem facing a small island population with no large draft animals, limited timber, and no metal tools. They had to quarry, transport, and raise blocks weighing many tons using stone hammers, wooden rollers, and rope made from local plant fiber, all coordinated across a community that likely numbered only in the low thousands at most. Stand inside one of the inner chambers today, and the air changes, cooler, closer, the daylight from the entrance narrowing down to a soft gray glow by the time it reaches the back wall. Run your hand along the stone, and in places you can still feel the pitted texture left by a stone hammer, striking the same spot thousands of times over, patiently, by someone with no metal chisel, and apparently all the time in the world to get the curve exactly right. Inside these temples, archaeologists have found the famous Sleeping Lady figurine and dozens of other corpulent carved figures, along with elaborate oracle chambers where a whispered voice could be made to echo and boom in ways that must have felt genuinely supernatural to anyone standing in the wrong spot. And then, sometime around 2500 BCE, after roughly 1,000 years of continuous temple building and use, the entire tradition simply stopped. The population appears to have collapsed or dramatically declined, possibly from soil exhaustion, on an island that could not sustain the demands being placed on it. A civilization capable of feats of stone engineering that still baffle modern builders vanished from an island a few dozen kilometers wide, leaving behind temples so old that by the time the next literate visitors arrived, they had already passed into legend as the work of giantesses. Number 9. The Jade Empire before the Empire. Now travel back to China, but forward in time from Jiahu to the lower reaches of the Yangtze River near modern Shanghai. Here, a culture called Liangzhu built what may be the earliest known Chinese state-level society, flourishing from roughly 3300 BCE. At its center was a walled city covering nearly 300 hectares, surrounded by an elaborate water management system, dams, canals, and reservoirs, engineered with enough sophistication that some archaeologists consider it among the oldest large-scale hydraulic infrastructure anywhere in the world. This was not a loose confederation of villages. This looks like a genuine early state, with a capital, a hierarchy of settlements around it, and specialized craft production organized at scale. And the object at the heart of Liangzhu culture was not grain, and it was not bronze, it was jade. Elite burials at Liangzhu contain astonishing quantities of finely carved jade objects, Kong tubes, bai discs, and ceremonial axes worked with a precision that would be difficult to replicate even with modern tools, let alone with the sand and cord abrasion techniques these craftspeople actually used. Picture the workshop where one of these pieces was made. An artisan seated cross-legged for hours at a stretch, drawing a length of hemp cord back and forth through wet sand and quartz grit against the surface of a jade block, the sound a dry, repetitive rasp, the progress measured not in minutes but in weeks, sometimes months, for a single ceremonial Kong no larger than a fist. That kind of investment of time only makes sense in a society wealthy and organized enough to feed and house a specialist who produces nothing you can eat. A single elite tomb might contain over 100 jade pieces, representing thousands of hours of specialized labor, meaning Liangzhu supported a class of full-time artisans, which in turn means it supported enough agricultural surplus and social stratification to free those artisans from having to grow their own food. All of this, the walls, the canals, the specialists, the clear evidence of ranked society, with rulers buried in splendor and commoners buried with almost nothing, existed roughly 1,000 years before the traditionally dated founding of China's first recognized dynasty, and around 1,500 years before clearly legible Chinese writing appears in the archaeological record. Liangzhu built the skeleton of a state, walls, water control, class division, monumental symbolism, and then, around 2300 BCE, it collapsed abruptly, likely under catastrophic flooding that overwhelmed even the elaborate dam system its engineers had built to prevent exactly that outcome. Picture the final months of the city. Water rising higher against the retaining walls than anyone alive could remember. Granaries flooding. The carefully maintained canals turning from an asset into a liability almost overnight. Families abandoning homes their grandparents had built, carrying whatever jade they could and leaving the rest to the silt. Its cities were buried under sediment and its name was lost entirely until 20th century archaeologists dug it back out of the mud, piece by careful piece. A state that had once rivaled anything in the ancient world, reduced to a rumor in its own country's memory. Number 10. The Marsh people before Sumer. Now consider the culture standing in the shadow of the civilization that gets all the credit. When people talk about the first civilization, they usually mean Sumer, the world of cuneiform tablets and city-states like Uruk and Ur. But Sumer did not spring from nothing. For roughly 2,500 years before Sumerian writing appears, a culture we call Ubaid was already living across the marshes and plains of southern Mesopotamia, beginning as early as 6500 BCE. The Ubaid people were building the first true villages of the region, then the first temples, then the first true towns, laying down the template that Sumerian civilization would later inherit, formalize, and eventually write down. At sites like Eridu, considered by the Sumerians themselves in their own later mythology to be the very first city on Earth, archaeologists have found a sequence of temples built one directly on top of another, each generation demolishing the old shrine and raising a new one on the exact same sacred spot, a practice that continued for well over 1,000 years before a single word of Sumerian was ever pressed into clay. Excavate down through that mound layer by layer, and you are walking backward through roughly 100 generations of the same unbroken devotion, each floor a little smaller, a little simpler, a little older, until the earliest shrine at the very bottom turns out to be barely more than a single small room with a pedestal and a fishbone offering left on it, the first flicker of an idea that would eventually become the god kings and towering ziggurats of Sumer proper. The Ubaid people were irrigating fields along the rivers, producing a distinctive style of painted pottery that spread across an enormous trading network stretching from the Persian Gulf up into Anatolia, and organizing labor around temple construction in a way that looks like the direct ancestor of the god-centered city-states that would follow them. When Sumerian writing finally does appear, around 3400 BCE, it does not describe the invention of civilization. It describes a civilization already ancient, inherited from ancestors the Sumerians themselves could only half remember, ancestors we now know were real, were skilled, and were quietly building the foundations of the world's first written cities for 2,500 years in total, unrecorded, unnamed silence. Number 11. The silence inside you. So you have walked with me through 10 different civilizations, spread across 4 continents and roughly 9,000 years, and every single one of them shares the same peculiar wound. They organize labor at a scale that should humble us. They tracked the stars, tuned instruments to precise scales, engineered water systems and stone temples that still stand or still baffle us, moved goods across thousands of miles, and in several cases, built cities larger than anything that would exist in first civilizations for another 1,000 years or more. And every one of them is voiceless. We know they existed because the dirt held on to them. We do not know what they called themselves, what they believed happened after death, in any detail, beyond a plastered skull or a careful burial, what stories they told their children at night, or what they actually thought they were building toward. The reason did not need to survive for the achievement to be real. The wall stood whether or not anyone ever wrote down why it was built. Here is where I want to leave you, he cut, because I think there is something in this pattern that reaches past archaeology and into your own life. We tend to measure worth by what gets recorded, the achievement that gets written down, photographed, posted, cited. The version of you that shows up in a resume or a headline, the version that exists in a database somewhere, and can therefore be searched, verified, and pointed to as proof that the thing actually happened. But Göbekli Tepe was extraordinary before anyone could read. Çatalhöyük held thousands of strangers together in peace for over a millennium, with no king to take credit for it, no chronicle boasting about the achievement, no monument inscribed with a ruler's name. The flute players of Jiahu made music that still works today, and not one of them ever signed their name to it, because the concept of a name surviving past a single lifetime through a written record simply did not exist for them yet. And it apparently did not need to for the music to matter. Civilization, real civilization, cooperation, meaning beauty, care for the dead, effort poured into something larger than one lifetime, never actually depended on being written down. Writing just made it easier for people like us, thousands of years later, to notice. Think about how much of what genuinely holds your own life together falls into that same unrecorded category. The quiet consistency of showing up for someone day after day. The skill you picked up from a parent or a mentor that you will pass on the same way, by demonstration, not by manual. The version of care that never gets photographed because the moment it happened, taking a picture would have missed the entire point of being present for it. None of that goes into a resume either, and none of it is any less real for the absence. So the next time you do something quietly excellent that nobody records, teach a skill to someone with no audience watching. Build something that will outlast the memory of who built it. Hold a community together with nothing but shared effort and no title to claim. Understand that you are doing something profoundly old. You are doing exactly what these 10 vanished civilizations did, long before history ever learned how to write anything down at all. They did not need us to remember them correctly in order to have been real, and neither, in the end, do you.